cup of coffee today outside in the rain. So cheers, everyone. Thank you for coming out of the blue zone to find us. And we'll do quick introductions. I'm Kaya.
Isatis.
Nioka.
Sarabeth.
Brilliant. Okay, and Nioka, shall we start with what you're working on here? And you can talk a little bit about South Africa and what they've been working on the negotiations?
Yes, so I'm here as an observer from an organization called Project 90 by 2030, and I work specifically on policy and research. And we're also housing the South African Climate Action Network, and I am a leadership development fellow in this space.
Wow, that's a lot of titles.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It's a mouthful. So specifically what I track is mitigation, but it's more about how do we see this being implemented, because it's great to have a deal, but what's the next steps and what happens in between here of the Paris Agreement and 2020 when the agreement actually comes into effect. So we can't just sit back and say we'll wait until 2020 arrives.
So what exactly is on the table to be scrapped for mitigation agreements? Because I know that there's a lot of talk last night, but do you know what the most updated version is?
So I think it's not really about what's not in the text in terms of mitigation, because generally it's quite good. It's optimistic compared to adaptation.
One of the
and
better ones.
Yeah, as opposed to loss and damage. The problem is the means of implementation. So it's great to have organizations and parties pushing 1.5 and decarbonization, but how do you get there? So capacity building, technology transfer, stuff on education, financing are big parts of just most of the agreement and historical responsibility, and I think that's where the hook is. It's differentiation and how do we get that, because that unlocks the finance and subsequently everything that comes after that, which is the implementation side of it.
Right. So you talk about differentiation. What are the different issues for developed countries and developing countries? Because South Africa is part of G77?
Yes.
Okay, so can you talk a little bit about what kind of issues are coming up? Now we're almost halfway through week 2.
I think it's more nobody can really decide on who deserves the financing, who has to give the financing, and what's the institutional space. So if you are currently an emitter and you previously weren't, what are your emissions actually attributed to? So for example, I think Tuvalu was talking about their level 5 hurricane. So
yes, this morning.
So which hurricane actually, which pocket of carbon and who emitted that actually, sort of caused that? And I think the causality aspect of most of it is I don't know where my carbon went to and it's still in that. It's just that sort of I sort of put it in there about 50 years ago, and you only put it there 10 years ago, and the effects, everyone knows they have responsibility, but trying to find out who has the more of the responsibility is where it's lying at the moment, and trying to define that.
And responsibility means financial support. Is that what it comes down to, or
historic responsibility?
Yeah.
But does that kind of equal how much? I mean, is the contingent point basically translates as
it translates as financial responsibility towards
and sort of
vulnerable ones.
Yeah, sure. So I think that the premise of this idea is financial responsibility is, you can probably separate it into 3 different categories. One's historical responsibility, one's future responsibility, and then the responsibility of the developed on behalf of the developing.
Yeah.
So 3 categorical responses, and all of that has to go into the where, what, why, and especially the how of what we do with climate finance, and that's what's being hammered out. And tomorrow night there's supposed to be another a drastic cut of draft agreements that's delivered to the president by evening time, and it'll be very interesting to see what that draft text looks like at this point, because the things that are on the table from a meeting that I just came from are absolutely codification of human rights based off of indigenous rights and developing rights within that text.
Yeah, just on that, I think people try to silo a lot of aspects of the current agreement that's quite long, is because they're we're here to only address climate change, but there's so many other ramifications. And in Ban Ki-moon's speech yesterday, he said we should not use 1.5 as a ceiling, but rather as a floor. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't be aiming for the top. I mean, there's so many. We apparently by the end of the year would be cooked into 1 degree. That's only 0.5 sort of space that we have to work in. So why are we trying to aim for 2 degrees, which is an extra 0.5? It's beyond me, and people are feeling huge strain. I mean, South Africa specifically is in the longest drought in 27 years, and there's 6 out of our 9 provinces that are in a state of emergency or being affected by it. So there's not a lot of dam, and we're in the middle of summer. It's not raining like it is here in the Northern Hemisphere. So there's those sort of aspects that come into play where you have to link your local context to this international space. And I think that most countries forget that. I mean, developed countries are not going to be... there was a minister that said it this morning.
Diplomacy.
Yeah. The minister said it this morning, and I can't remember which country it was. It might have been Somalia. He's like, I'm sorry to tell you, but climate change doesn't stop at border control. It doesn't say, oh, sorry,
No,
I
it was
can't.
the Somalian president.
Yeah.
Prime Minister.
Yeah, I can't, yeah, Prime Minister. I can't get in just because you say so. It has no sort of privacy, and I think that's what you actually have to get down to, is that it's a sense of humanity, and it's not these imaginary political spaces that we have at the end of the day.
That is very interesting. I want to touch on 1.5 as well, because that came up yesterday.
Yeah.
And I think has Canada come forward as supporting 1.5 now? Is that true?
Yes, they have absolutely formally endorsed the 1.5 methodology, and that's something that certainly hit a large portion of the news networks. But I also think, as an underscore to that, while they also approve of human rights within textual agreements, they don't want that drafted into this particular text agreement because they feel it erodes away from other resolutions like the Geneva Conventions or other institutionalized preferences that are meant to codify human rights. So they don't want to see that as a part of this because they would like it just to focus on climate science. But I don't think it's any more a question of science at this point, but it's a geopolitical question. And that's what I think many formal leaders, it's not that they fail to recognize it, but they realize how complicated it is.
And I think trying to put that all into one document and trying to limit it to 20 pages or 15 pages, it's also quite difficult. Trying to get everyone's
Script
textual
notes for human
suggestions and trying to navigate this.
Oh, we got a sneeze coming. It's the rain.
Yeah, it's the rain. I thought it was the sun that made you sneeze.
But it's just so complicated, and I don't think that they can actually. It's very difficult for the diplomats to try and understand it and then put it into something that's legal language when it's so inherently sitting with most of the population.
They've kind of set themselves an almost impossible task here.
So we hear that there was a walkout today trying to support the 1.5. Can you tell us a little bit on that?
I mean, I was there for the planning procedures. Unfortunately, I didn't get to watch it because I was in a different meeting. So I think you were there, weren't you?
Yeah. So it was pretty impressive of the turnout that came.
Damn it.
And
see it.
they had a pathway of it was more mobilization action, and it was a pathway. So it was 1.5, and it had a hope sign over it, and then one that said 3 degrees, because on the current INDC equity review and most of the IPCC review of that, they had a 2.7 degree with the current
current state of affairs. That's how it will project.
So basically, all the
2020.
countries have put forward in their contributions will get us to about 2.7.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's excluding, I think, 12 INDCs. So I'm not sure where we're sitting.
Nicaragua still has yet to submit theirs, so I'm sure that will have huge effects on our global economy.
Yeah, so that's like using the 3 degree mark as what we're going towards. And they had a few representatives of ministers and just dressed up, and they had to go through a gate of 5-year cycles, the INDC review, because what civil society is asking for is an INDC review, the latest in 2018, so that we've put them through now. But things are changing so rapidly, and there's so much of technology advancement and so much of advancement in our spaces. Why can't we review it again before it comes into effect in 2020?
So review with the idea that it could be made more ambitious.
Yeah.
They call it a ratcheting up mechanism, right? I think that's the sexy UN word that's being passed around now. But,
and then there's a few like ambition mechanisms that they want to put forward, as well as like making sure that we decarbonize by 2050. So using those sort of and those were the representatives, and you have to go through a gate and shake the hands of the 4 people that represented those aspects to get through to the 1.5, because it's not it's not only about talking about 1.5, it's about actually making steps towards reaching the 1.5.
So it's nice to hear kind of actions happening inside the blue zone where, you know, we're not allowed to go, but like actions happening where people are visualizing, like finding ways to visualize these kind of abstract ideas in the text.
As I was running out here to find Yoko and bring her out for the meeting, I walked by the Sustain Us delegation, and they, the youth advocates that draw the zero for decarbonization around their left eye, and they were chanting for full decarbonization methods. They had a huge banner, an enormous group of people, and we always talk about this, like what is the meaning of nonviolent direct action displays within the blue zone and the plenary itself? Are they distractions, or are they actually meaningful to the process? And I think two of these events today, they do help to build political pressure on it, at least on the inside. But at the question of if it's still allowed or supported by security staff, how much of a nonviolent direct action is it really, if it's permissible?
I think that, I mean, the internal space is quite limited in terms of the presence of civil society, and we all know that the COP is one of the biggest, but it's just the beginning. So, I mean, there should be actions on the inside and on the outside, and obviously in the state of play in France, it's not allowed, but that's not stopping people from outside France to mobilize and make their voices heard, and to speak to their representatives in their country, saying, hey, we know what's going on in the UN and the UNFCCC and COP21, and this is what we want. And I mean, this is the time. We have a few days left, and according to the COP president, he wants to finish by Friday. So,
And, I mean, he is speeding along.
Well, that's a great call to action to end on, I think. So thank you for joining us, and here's to a few more days. We'll stay tuned. Yeah, thanks. Cheers, guys.
Citizens Voice.
Citizens Voice.
Citizens Voice.
Citizens Voice.
Citizens Voice.
Citizens Voice.